Before we get into it, we're tackling some heavy topics here relating to abuse, mental illness, and suicide. So just a heads up. It's hard to be a kid. You're navigating a new world, trying to understand it, learning about other people and yourself, going through puberty and years of awkwardness that sometimes stretches into adulthood. And LGBTQ plus kids can sometimes have it even harder. Many have to balance all of that while worrying about being bullied for who they are and worrying if their parents will still love them the same way if they come out. Now, we're dealing with a few really important terms, so let's take a moment to get you hip. It's important to distinguish sex, which is based on biological characteristics, from gender, which is based on societal perceptions and norms. Being transgender means that your gender identity differs from your sex assigned at birth. There's a growing awareness of transgender and non-binary identities, but discrimination is still rampant in parts of life as complicated as healthcare to things as simple as where to go pee. It takes a toll on mental health, according to Dr. Jack Drescher, a clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and an expert on LGBTQ plus mental health issues.
There are lots of places where kids have to hide their identities from those around them. That comes at a cost. Sometimes it may come at the cost of their mental health in terms of anxiety, sometimes depression. There are some statistics that indicate thinking about suicide is more common, among particularly transgender kids.
In a survey released last year by the LGBTQ plus suicide prevention effort, the Trevor Project, found that more than half of all transgender and non-binary young people seriously contemplated suicide in 2020. And in the last couple of years, it's those kids who have been put under a microscope by state legislatures across the country. Republicans have introduced a spate of laws focused on transgender youth, proposing laws restricting their ability to play sports, blocking them from changing their birth certificates, and denying them from accessing health care that aligns with their gender identity. Advocates have pushed these laws in an effort to give parents more say over decisions relating to their children as minors. They've come in conjunction with other efforts like the push for parents to have more of a say in what their kids learn at school and bans on certain books or discussion topics. Many of those, like critical race theory, relate to race, gender, or social justice issues. The issue of trans athletes playing sports, a target of several state laws, is obviously part of all of this, but is also its own complex story, maybe for a future edition of In the Loop. But a lot of these laws go well beyond the playing field. In Texas, Republican Governor Greg Abbott issued an executive order last month directing the state's Child Protective Services to consider parents who allow their kids gender-affirming care to be considered as potential cases of child abuse. But when we talk about gender-affirming care for minors, we're generally not talking about surgeries. Gender-affirming care can include everything from taking hormones to getting counseling or therapy to deal with life struggles to even speech therapy if you want your voice to align with your gender. In Arkansas, Republican legislators passed a bill that banned doctors from administering or even referring transgender youth for treatments that would affirm their gender. That bill passed despite a veto from the state's Republican governor, Asa Hutchinson, who argued the bill was government overreach. The law is currently not in effect, as court battles are still ongoing. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, is suing both Arkansas and Texas for their actions. And as the ACLU's Rose Sachs told us, their challenges are rooted in the civil rights of the affected kids and their parents.
These bills, they pose a range of problems, but all of them, by targeting trans people for who they are, that is, of course, a constitutional problem. The government is not allowed to treat people differently because of who they are without a sufficient reason. And where it targets people based on their gender and their gender identity and their gender expression, the government should not be denying people's fundamental right to access care and interfering with parents' rights to make decisions about their children's best interest.
And medically, these treatments are well researched. Gender-affirming care has the support of the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics. Both have condemned laws that block access to gender-affirming care, with the AMA calling the bans a dangerous intrusion into the practice of medicine, and the American Academy of Pediatrics noting that gender-affirming care can help address mental health and thoughts of suicide. So according to those medical groups, this treatment could, in some cases, actually be the difference between life and death. Now, the lawmakers pushing for these laws that restrict access to gender-affirming care argue that children really aren't capable of making decisions around this topic. Arkansas and Tennessee are the two states that signed bills governing trans healthcare issues into law, and bills in Alabama and Idaho would make prescribing hormone treatments a felony punishable by up to 10 years in Alabama or life in prison in Idaho. Those bills are currently moving through the legislature. In Idaho, supporters of the law are focusing on banning the possibility of surgeries for minors, but have extended their proposed ban to more reversible treatments like puberty blockers and hormone treatments. State Representative Bruce Skog, sponsor of the Idaho bill, defended the ban to a state House committee, saying he had concerns about the treatments and potential side effects.
If we do not allow minors to get a tattoo, drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, sign a legal contract, why would we allow them to go through these physical mutilations because of their feelings at the time?
As a reminder, doctors generally don't recommend surgeries for transgender youth, instead encouraging the other, more reversible treatments that this bill also bans. But nevertheless, these laws have become pretty widespread. 21 states introduced legislation that would limit trans healthcare, and bans on trans youth playing in sports that conform with their gender have also taken off. 31 states introduced bills, and at least 11 have enacted them into law. And a lot of these laws don't even use the word transgender, and that's consistent with both moral and legal arguments of those crafting these laws, according to Scott McCoy, an attorney with the civil rights legal nonprofit Southern Poverty Law Center.
I think the reason why these bills oftentimes don't single out transgender individuals by using the classification of transgender is, first, the proponents of these bills don't even believe that transgender is a thing, right? The other reason why, legally, if you're singling out a particular class of individuals by name, it's just easier to challenge that as a targeting of a particular class.
In Florida, legislators passed a ban on trans female athletes competing in women's sports last year. And this year, they're moving ahead with pieces of legislation, one officially named the Stop Woke Act, and another dubbed the Don't Say Gay bill by opponents that would limit conversations on gender and sexual identities for young children and could make it harder for LGBTQ plus youth to keep their identities protected from their parents if they're not ready to come out. Opponents worry that could prevent LGBTQ plus students from seeking out teachers as a resource.
Had I had teachers that stood up for me or could help me better understand what I clearly did not understand, I would not have had to hide myself or lie about who I am. You say these discussions should only happen between a parent and a child. Not all children are the same. I didn't run home to ask my parents what these things were. I was scared and ashamed.
Okay, let's go deeper on two of the states we've highlighted here, Florida and Texas. They're two of the three most populous states in the union and the two largest states to have passed laws focused on transgender and other LGBTQ plus youth. Joining us now from Florida is Brooke Badinger. Brooke is a youth culture and education reporter for the South Florida Sun-Sentinel, and they have been covering many of the bills we've talked about. Thank you so much for joining us, Brooke.
Thank you for having me.
So let's see if we can get up to speed here. You know, what's the latest on this law that we're focusing on? And I'm kind of curious to know, you know, will Governor DeSantis sign this law?
The law passed on this past week on Tuesday, after it had been going back and forth, in the legislature for the last, basically since the start of the session. And so now it goes to Governor Ron DeSantis's desk, and he has indicated, his support for it, that he most likely intends to sign it into law.
And I guess out of curiosity, as a way to really kind of understand the scope and the impact, what does this final bill do specifically?
Sponsors of the bill say basically what it does is it gives parents more power and control over the curriculum that their kids are exposed to. There's a part in it that, says basically gender identity and sexual orientation will not be taught, in schools, but experts say that because of that sentence, and because what the law also does is it gives parents basically the right to sue if they suspect that a school has violated that clause of the law. That will basically have a chilling effect on really any speech, any instruction, anything like that relating to gender, sexual orientation in school.
We've talked a little bit about, what effect this could have on, kids who would be impacted by this legislation. But I'm curious to know, how are these same kids responding to this legislation?
Yeah, so across the state, I mean, kids have been really, really active in protesting this. And there are really a lot of students who, wouldn't normally go into the spotlight are kind of coming out to talk against these bills and talk about how it will harm them in school, their peers. So these kids are really standing up, taking a stand and saying that even if, it technically the language of the bill only goes through third grade, but a lot of kids, even in high school, are saying that they think that chilling effect would permeate, through higher grades as well. And they feel like their rights are really being kind of taken away from them.
Brooke Baininger is a youth, culture, and education reporter for the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. Brooke, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
It's a slightly different situation in Texas, where the most recent concern is about an executive action from the governor rather than a bill in the legislature. We have Lauren McGaughy to help us break this down. She's an investigative reporter for the Dallas Morning News focused on gender, sexuality, and politics. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Yeah, so let's get everybody up to speed here. What's the latest on Governor Abbott's order directing Child Protective Services to look into gender-affirming care as potential child abuse?
In February, we had an attorney general opinion come out that reinterpreted existing law, saying that child abuse could include gender-affirming care and some common treatments such as puberty blockers and hormone therapy. So after that opinion came out, which is non-binding, it's not a new law, but the governor saw it and he ran with it, and he did direct state agencies to investigate any and all reports of minors receiving these kinds of treatments.
What all have we seen happen since the governor kind of put out this directive?
One of the first parents who was contacted by child welfare actually works for the child welfare agency. And this parent alleges that they were put on leave and put under investigation for seeking treatments for their transgender teenage daughter. And now that state worker is suing the state and trying to get the investigation into their family halted. And the judge may consider taking that temporary restraining order just against this one family's investigation and take it statewide. That would, halt any current investigations into other families across the state.
I understand there have been dozens of bills introduced, in 2021. What else have we seen come out of Texas regarding this particular community of young people?
State lawmakers did pass a new law that would require transgender youth to play on sports teams that match their sex at birth. But the lawmakers also filed a bill that would have formally redefined gender-affirming care treatments like the ones we're talking about as abuse, and that legislation did not pass. So, there's various attempts to pick away at the rights of both trans youth and adults and LGBTQ people more generally.
Is there any relationship between, a push on these laws and the fact that there is an election coming up later in the year?
I think if you ask Democrats in Texas, they would say yes. We do know that there have been treatments like this available to trans minors for years in Texas. In fact, there's a clinic that recently shuttered treatments to new patients after political pressure. I can't get into the heads of Republicans, but it is an election year, and it's also the first real competitive primary election season for Republicans in Texas in a long time. So we saw a lot of incumbent Republicans duking it out with challengers that were further right than they were, and really pushing them to be more aggressive on a number of issues, in this one in particular.
Lauren McGaughy is an investigative reporter focusing on gender, sexuality, and politics for Dallas Morning News. Lauren, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks again for having me on.